All right, so we're going to take a little bit of time and look at the idea of annotating texts for literary analysis. So when we annotate, all we're doing is we're marking and taking note over things that we notice in the reading. So we're really just going to kind of focus on 5 key ideas, and then other things may fit into these categories, or we may notice some other stuff as well. So what we're looking at is we're looking at point of view, we're looking at setting, characterization, plot and conflict, and symbolism. And all we're going to do is, as we read through it, we're just going to take note over what we notice. And that's the key idea before we even begin looking at what we are annotating, is to focus on this key idea of observing. We are not trying to necessarily understand everything. We're not trying to analyze everything just yet. We are just noticing what we read. So keep that in mind as we move forward. So the first thing we're going to look at is point of view. All right, point of view is simply the perspective from which the story is told. Now we've got things like first person, third person narration, and all that, but there are other aspects of point of view, like the perspective from which it's told. So things that we want to pay attention to when we're looking at point of view, we want to look at the narrator. Who is the narrator? Is it first person, third person, anything like that? We also want to look sometimes at the original context, the author who wrote this, what is some of the context that it's being written out of. That gives us some perspective of why the author might have written it to begin with. And then we also want to look at the overall kind of tone of the story. The tone of the story, the author's approach to the topic is going to help us with theme, because any kind of negative tone will probably present a more negative theme, whereas a positive tone would present more of a positive kind of theme. So when we look at point of view, think about the way that the narrator's point of view can affect the telling of the story. We take something as simple as the Joker from Batman. If he's narrating a story versus Batman, we're going to get 2 different tellings of the story. The events may be the same, but the way that it's told would be different. So if the Joker is telling the story, one, that personality of this kind of lighthearted, crazy, goofy jokester is going to come out in the telling of the story. But also, we're going to get probably some justifications for crimes and all of that kind of stuff. Whereas if Batman is telling the story, it's going to take on a lot more of a serious tone. It's going to be focused on ideas like justice and all of that. So keep that kind of stuff in mind as you're looking at point of view. So some questions that you want to look at is, is it first person or third person? Is the narrator participating in the story or just observing? Is if it is first person, how reliable is the narrator? Somebody like the Joker who is lost his mind is probably not going to be a very reliable narrator. If it's in third person perspective, is the narrator omniscient? Does the narrator know everything that's going on inside everybody's head, or is it very limited? Does the point of view shift? Sometimes when you shift scenes, you shift the point of view. What impact does that have? And then something like, how does the narrator's tone affect us as readers? How does that tone affect us? So that's the kind of stuff you want to take note over for point of view. Next up, we have looking at setting. Setting, we know when and where something takes place. So when we're annotating for setting, things that we want to pay attention to, one is something like archetypal settings. There are common settings that are used in stories that represent certain ideas, and we can expect certain things to happen. Weather is also a key thing to pay attention to when you're looking at setting. Geography, where it's taking place, the culture, all of that kind of stuff. And then the mood. What does the setting do for us as a reader? Does it create tension in us? Does it create anxiety, and all of that? So when we're looking at setting, some examples that we might look at. So we might have a desert, which is kind of an archetypal setting. Deserts often represent struggle. They can represent kind of this idea of cleansing, of testing, of being purified through trials. And so you might look at how that connects with something that's going on in the story with a character. something like a thunderstorm using weather. We can use a thunderstorm to foreshadow bad things happening, or of course, any kind of ironic use of that. We might even take something like fog, um, that fog which creates visual impairment. We can't really see what's going on. The character can't see what's in front of them. So it can set up this kind of mysterious mood. It can hide things. And so we would take note of that as we're going along, and then see later on if we can connect it to other things happening in the story. So some things to pay attention to: think what's the geographical setting, the time, the place, weather, and then why is it important? If weather is factoring into the story, what is it doing? Is it creating conflict, or whatever? Uh, think about how weather may be used symbolically, how it can relate to characters or plot events that are happening. Again, with historical context or the social environment being depicted, what kind of background information might we need to know? If we've got something that is set in World War II, then we need to understand some of the World War II context, not our modern day kind of setting. And then thinking about what kind of details does the author use to create that mood, to create something in us. Next up, we have characterization. We're looking at how characters are developing, changing, evolving over the course of the story. So when we look at characterization, some things to pay attention to: this idea of sharing meals in stories will show us any kind of relationship indicators, any kind of tension between characters, and stuff like that. We have what we call vampire characters who feed off of others and drain others. Maybe you can notice how a character is taking advantage of other characters throughout the story. Of course, we've got character archetypes. You got your hero archetype, the mentor, the villain, the sidekick. There's lots of character archetypes on there. When we identify character archetypes, then we can set expectations for what will happen in the story, make guesses, and all of that kind of stuff. Physical marks, scars, deformities, anything like that, often will separate characters out. And when they are separated, they're kind of focused on a little bit more. We can also look at the idea of blindness. Blind characters connect a lot to truth in the story. And then things like illnesses, stuff that kind of singles out characters and show us different things about that. So some examples with characterization. If I'm taking something like the Lord of the Rings, see Gandalf, he's a mentor character, so I expect him to be a wise character who's going to help the hero along the journey. And if he acts out of character, then I'm going to pay attention to that and notice that, and probably ask why. Somebody like Harry Potter, who has the scar, that singles him out. It separates him from the rest of the world to kind of set him up as that hero character and push him forward. There's a lot about that makes him uncomfortable, that makes him feel isolated, that kind of drives him forward. And then you might have somebody like Daredevil, who is blind, and his character is very much about justice, and this idea of being blind helps him to see the truth of who people really are inside. So we make note of that. So some questions that we might look at, looking at the main characters: who's the protagonist, who's the antagonist, what do we know about them, how do they relate to each other? If we get a meal, how does that meal reveal the relationships between those characters? How does a character change from beginning to end? Are they the same way that they were when we first met them? If we have character archetypes, do they kind of break away from those traditional archetypes? And if they do, why is that significant? What function do main characters play? Do some characters see themselves differently from the way readers see them? If so, how? And what does that kind of indicate about them? If they've got some external marks, how would those reflect some kind of internal aspect to their character? All right, the fourth thing we're looking at is plot and conflict. We're just simply looking at the problem and then how we're trying to resolve that problem. So things that we want to pay attention to when we're looking for plot and conflict. Think any kind of trips, quests. If a character is going somewhere, they are on a quest for something. What is that kind of self-realization that they're looking for? There's also archetypal plots. So you got like a romance story follows the same kind of plot arc. A hero's quest follows the same plot arcs. So we got those. And then this idea of intertextuality, of stories that connect to each other that we can draw from. So a good example when we look at something like plot and conflict, a lot of people know Romeo and Juliet, the story of Romeo and Juliet, written by Shakespeare. Two people who fall in love, but their families are at odds with each other, so they can't be together. That creates the conflict, and then everything happens going forward from there. But we can connect these with other stories too. So something like West Side Story, we still have two people who fall in love who are members of opposing groups. Taking that even further, a movie like Titanic, we have two people who fall in love, but instead of like a fight between their two groups, it's more of a separation due to class. So it does not always have to be a specific one-to-one kind of correlation. In all three of these stories, we essentially have two characters who are in love with each other, but something is keeping them apart. And that would be intertextuality. And we can make guesses and make connections from all of that. There's a lot of things that we would look at for questions to consider for plot and conflict, and just looking at how the conflict moves forward, where's the climax of the story, is it resolved, how is it resolved, uh, when the protagonist goes on a trip or a quest, what do they learn from that? And then how do those stories connect to other stories? It can help us with analysis because we can pull in ideas that we get from other stories with similar experiences. Last thing we're going to look at is symbolism. So symbols, objects that kind of represent other things. So what we want to pay attention to with symbols, one, allusions, any kind of references to other works, which is difficult if we don't know what the reference is. Any kind of object that is symbolic. We can also look at ironic use of symbols here. And then motifs, some kind of pattern that comes up all throughout the story. Typically, a lot of times you'll get symbols that are revisited throughout a story. That would be a motif. So take, for example, let's say in my story, I have a couple who are in love. And at the beginning of the story, we see like a rose that is about to bloom. So budding rose, that would probably symbolize this young, new, budding, growing love. I might use it as a motif midway through the story. I come back to that rose and see that now it has withered and is faded. And what that's going to do is it's going to kind of indicate that the same thing is happening with this love, that it is getting old. Maybe it's dying. Maybe it's not being taken care of or whatever. And then at the end of the story, maybe what we see is that somehow the rose has been rejuvenated. It's come back to life. That would indicate that the two characters have renewed their love for each other. Or I could do something like have a maybe there's a different rose that blooms in a different color that would indicate like a new love for a character. So you're just kind of looking at those symbols and how they reflect other things about the characters. So things that we want to kind of look at, what objects does a writer seem to emphasize? So if something is really focused on, then probably it's going to be symbolic of something. So if you get long paragraphs describing one single object, think how that might be symbolic. What might be symbolic about the setting, like we talked about earlier, what characters or aspects of those characters can be symbolic. Characters can embody certain ideas and be symbolic of those ideas. Events can be symbolic as well. Think about common symbol archetypes. Like I just use a rose as a very common symbol for love. The fire is a common symbol. Ice is a common symbol. Think, are there any recurring patterns or images throughout the story? And as you start to interpret the symbols, how does it fit in with the context of the story? Does it connect with some of those other things that you've noticed as well. And then what larger significance do these symbolic things have? How do they connect larger to a more thematic kind of way? So again, what we're looking at is just we're taking notes over these ideas, and then after we get through the story and all of that, we're going to sit back and we're going to look at all the information we gathered to then do the analysis part.